5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Puck short.
Hello everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of the One Puck Short podcast. Delighted to be joined by a returning guest today from NHL.com. Please welcome Kevin Woodley. Kevin, hi, how are you?
I'm good, Rob. It's good to connect again. It's been too long.
It has, absolutely. As I mentioned, you were on one of the beat writers for NHL.com covering the Vancouver Canucks. Maybe later on or the next episode we'll touch on your other hat as in-goal media's goalie guru. But this, as I said, is the NHL.com side of your life with the Canucks, who've had a pretty interesting season so far. They're currently, as we speak on this Thursday, in a wildcard spot in a pretty crazy Western Conference wildcard race. They've played a couple more games than a few of the teams around them. They've played 54 games and they've got 54 points. The Blues are just behind them with 51 games played. The Avs as well. The Coyotes, incredibly, the Blackhawks are back into it. It's been a wild season for the Canucks so far. They still might make the playoffs. I mean, what have you made of the campaign for the Canucks so far?
I mean, like you said, it's been... wild's a word for it, I guess. Unexpected, I think, would be the word that gets used around here most often. It has been an unexpected level of success. I don't think anyone predicted that they would be in a playoff race this year. I don't think anyone, even the most optimistic, anticipated Elias Pettersson having this type of impact this early in his career. Like, I think we all knew from what we saw in the Swedish Hockey League that this was a special player. But I'm not sure anyone was saw him in that sort of generational talent type of thing. And he really has changed everything for this team. Like that, it's sort of impossible to overstate the impact he's had on this group as a 20-year-old, not just in terms of the scoring and the results, but like he sort of has a drive, and we see it in his defensive play and his play away from the puck for his age, not just to sort of quiet the naysayers, but he sort of leads. I mean, other players on this team point to him as, incredulous at times for the work ethic, for the defensive effort, for the way he's able to play in his own zone at his age as a center. We see so many other guys when they come over at this age, they're eased into the league as wingers. Like he's changed everything for this team, and yet, despite that, I think you would be foolish, and I hope management isn't, to take a look at what you just laid out in terms of the playoff picture and not see it for what it is. And that's, yes, a compelling race, but it's based in large part on teams struggling. And I think if you were to look big picture and look maybe higher up the Western Conference at what it's going to take to be one of the teams that legitimately has a chance to make a long playoff run and win a Stanley Cup, they're still a long ways away from that. And so I think the consternation locally is, hey, enjoy it. It's fun. It's great. We're in a playoff race. But, are we going to do anything stupid? Is this team going to do anything stupid and mortgage future in any way, shape, or form based on the promise of the present? Because I think if you really look at it, the present is still a ways off from, there's still a couple players short, a couple high-end players short from really being competitive in the Western Conference. And let's be honest, the best way, Pettersson being the best example, to get that talent is through the draft.
Yeah, and to touch on that point, I mean, the Canucks have got pretty much all their picks for the next at least 3 years. They've added some late round picks as well via trades, so that they're well stocked heading into not just the next draft, but the two after that. But just looking at this trade deadline, given where they are, do you think maybe they are tempted to try and add someone, maybe a veteran presence with a, if they can grab somebody with a third or fourth round pick? Brian Boyle obviously went to the Predators on Wednesday for a sort of a mid-round pick. Nothing to a lot of teams quite throwaways. Do the Canucks try and replicate that and just pick up a veteran presence just to give them maybe a little boost heading down the stretch?
Oh God, I hope not. No, honestly, and I think the good news is maybe the best thing for the Canucks fans that are on this side of the fence of we are a ways away. This team is a ways away for those fans, and can't afford to be making moves like that. Is the fact that Vancouver hosts the draft this year, and Jim Benning has said, I mean, give him credit for identifying where they are at to this extent. He said he's not trading draft picks. He recognizes they're not at a stage where they can trade draft picks. I think a lot of people would argue that they should have been stockpiling picks for the past couple of years. I think some of those people argue that even today they should be stockpiling picks for this year's draft. You can point to them and say, you're right, yeah, they have all their picks. Hasn't always been the case, but then take a look at, compare them to the Detroit Red Wings. I mean, I don't have, in front of me, but I think like over the past 3 years or past 2 years plus this season coming up, the Red Wings essentially have an entire extra draft of picks. Like they're something in the neighborhood of plus 10 with draft picks over those 3 years, and the Canucks are at best neutral. And for a team that's rebuilding, that leaves a lot of us scratching our head, especially, I guess, the thing that makes it even more sort of, head scratching is they've been good at the draft. They've had more hits than misses. They've had more hits at the draft than they've had on the trade front or in the free agency front, and yet they haven't shown a tendency to stockpile those picks. And so the questions that are being asked locally aren't so much do we add, because I don't think they will. It's more should they be subtracting. The injury to Alex Edler may make this a moot point, depending on how long it takes him to come back from this concussion he suffered this week. But there's a player that's an unrestricted free agent, and there's a lot of debate here in Vancouver about whether they should be dealing him as a top pair defenseman who could probably command a decent return on that same trade market that got you a second-round pick for Boyle if you're the New Jersey Devils. Or retaining him. What they can't afford to do is lose him for nothing. So at least if he stays, there's talk of re-signing him to an extension. He has he's got control over his destiny in terms of no trade clause and those types of things. But, there seems to be a willingness to maybe sign an extension. And as much as part of me cringes at a team whose future is probably 2 or 3 years away, the real upside, signing an extension of 3 years, probably minimum, for a 32-year-old defenseman, that makes me nervous for a guy who's already got an injury history. At least it wouldn't be a repeat of what we saw with Dan Hamhuis here, where they didn't recoup assets at the deadline and he just skated away as a free agent. I mean, this organization can't afford really another black eye like that. I think they realize it, and yet you hope it's not just optics that has them wanting to re-sign him and re-up on him, because Edler's still their best defenseman, and I don't know if that's so much that's praise of him because he is good, but also an indictment of the organization in terms of their ability to develop their own defenseman coming in behind him. So it's they're still in the muddy middle, Rob, and there's some hard choices coming up in terms of how they get out of it. And a lot of people here in Vancouver are ready to maybe not take to the streets for another riot, like after every Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final we have in Vancouver. But certainly there'll be some Twitter riots depending on which way they handle this situation.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the cap situation or the contract situation heading into the summer, as we sort of moved on to that point, as you said, Edler, a UFA, Ben Hutton is an RFA, Derek Pouliot is also an RFA. They've got a couple of others in there. Most notably of all is Brock Besser. And although they've got potentially, or their projected cap space for next season is pretty high, they've still got to find probably about 7 guys. And as I said, including re-signing Brock Besser.
Well, and I think you need to project even further out than, like, Besser shouldn't be a problem, like you said, because of the cap room. I think he probably commands a Nylander type number. I don't know that that's the best equivalent, but that's probably the ballpark, the range you're looking at coming out of RFA. But I think you have to prepare for Pettersson being closer to a Matthews type number, if not more, when he comes out of his entry level 2 years from now. And then you have to remember that Quinn Hughes, there's a good chance he signs out of Michigan. They don't look like a team that's going to go on a playoff run in the NCAA, and his season could be over as soon as early March. And now you could have him burning a year on his contract this season, the way Besser did after his college year ended when he first came out. And now you'd have Pettersson and Quinn Hughes. coming out of their entry-level contracts at the same time. And that's where you need to project to before when you start to look at where this team's going to be when it matters, when they should be competitive, when they need to be competing for a cup. And that's where, contracts like Edler's, depending on how they look a couple of years from now, contracts like Beagle's, as much as you'd maybe not check it in as a pure win for Jim Benning, but not as bad a loss as some of the other free agent signings. That's where these things start to matter. Yeah. We're making mistakes on fourth liners in terms of money and terms start to matter. And where the decisions you make, like right now, like if that is the timeline for them to truly be competitive, like what's Edler like at that point as a 35-year-old compared to what you might get with a draft pick you get in exchange for him now? Like what's going to help you when it really matters more? Edler at 35 or a late first-round pick this year potentially in exchange for him. And those are that's the type of foresight that this organization probably needs to have. And it'll be interesting to see how they handle this, going down the stretch. I mean, we saw it with Chris Tanev. I understand why they're hesitant to trade Alex Edler. The defense is not good as is, and it's typically a lot worse without him. It's the same problem with Chris Tanev. And so they missed their window where Tanev was a valuable asset. He's got one more year left on his deal, and he's a diminishing asset now. And so is he going to help you 3 years from now? The indications over the past year, maybe some of them are health related. The way he's been up and down, I would say not as much as he could have if you'd, again, gotten a high return for him a couple of years ago. And the conversation now might be, what about Brandon Sutter, who is essentially a shutdown center who provides little to no offense, is still seen as valuable by other teams around the league, especially teams that covet that. We all see how many times it's a third line center that gets credited for the work they do on a playoff run.
Right. Yeah.
Here's a guy who could be incredibly valuable at the trade deadline with term left on his contract, and yet, much like Tanev, you get the sense here locally that they're more likely to hold on to him and wait till he's a diminishing asset rather than try and move in advance, get ahead of it, and recognize that maybe what you might get back now could, again, help you when you're really ready to make a run at it more than Brandon Sutter will 2 or 3 years from now.
I mean, looking at Sutter's contract situation, he's got another 2 years after this one at $4.375 million. Do you think, and there's a no trade clause as well, do you think ignoring the NTC, which, all right, air quotes, pie in the sky type situation, but does the cap hit maybe put some potential suitors off, do you think? Because as you said, for a third or fourth line guy, that's going to be quite steep for a lot of cup contenders, I think, when they start fishing for a depth centre.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends how you see him. If you see him as a real shutdown type guy, I guess his ticket's not terrible. It depends where the team is. Could the Leafs fit him in? No. Would they have any need for him? Probably not. But there are other teams that could probably make that work. And the irony to me is we're now seeing teams, we saw it with the Leafs with Jake Muzzin, where you used to look at guys as pure rentals. Well, if teams see a value in a guy, sometimes it's higher because he has term left, and it's not unreasonable. I guess maybe I'm biased because I'm here in Vancouver and I look at Brandon Sutter's cap hit and I compare it to what's around him, like say Louis Eriksson at $6 million, and it's like, geez, that's not that bad. But maybe you're right. Maybe other teams look at that as prohibitive. I think when you look at the way the cap is trended up, if you can convince a team that Brandon Sutter is, has ability to be a leading penalty killer and a shutdown guy who can go up against other teams' top lines and win matchups in the playoffs, if you still see him as that guy, and I would argue that's diminishing as well, but if you still see him as that guy, I don't think that cap hit's quite as prohibitive as we might be making out.
We've talked about Pettersson as the kind of the dynamo. Brock Best has been the goal scorer. Sutter and Eriksson have, veteran presence are probably more useful these days than Eriksson. But two guys who came in with high hopes attached to them, who've quietly, I think, had decent years, or at least looking from the outside, are Bo Horvat and Jake Virtanen. And where are they at in their cycle right now with the Canucks?
I think Horvat was exceptional early through the first half of the season. He looks like a guy who is maybe wearing down. I think it's 1 goal in his last 15. Been a little bit snake bit, still creating chances. just not finishing on them. And there's a frustration level that's creeping in there. He was used for a long stretch, especially when Sutter was out. He was used in a real tough matchup shutdown role. I think he had some of the toughest, if you sort of do quality of competition analysis. I've read some things that say he may have had some of the toughest minutes of any center in the NHL. They've tried to ease that up a little bit with Sutter back and Beagle getting more of those strict matchup minutes. But what they haven't done is given him wingers that are complementary from an offensive standpoint. He really has been sort of asked to carry the lines he's on. He hasn't got a lot of help offensively, and you've seen his production fall off as a result. So still a good season, but as things have kind of slowed down for the team. I mean, this what he was doing in December was remarkable. I thought he was actually overlooked outside of this market for the season he was having, for all the attention and stories that were being generated by Pettersson, by Besser, or about those two. There was a time where I really thought that Bo deserved to be in that conversation. Right. But, he's slipped since then. His play has slipped since then. And part of that is, sort of anchoring a helicopter line with no wings. So as far as Virtanen goes, there are signs there of the power forward they hope he can become. He's obviously, he scored more this year. I think he matched a career high the other day with 30 some odd games to go, and those are all positives. There's still a lot of in and out with him. Shifts games where he plays, and you go, where is this on a nightly basis? and sometimes that's not fair. Like that power forward game is really hard to maintain. Sometimes it takes longer to sort of figure out what it takes to play that way every night. He's showing more skill this year. He spent some time in the offseason working with Pavel Barber, in terms of trying to build up his skill game. I do think, and I think the organization's to blame for this at times, they kept telling him to put his head down and go to the net and be this power guy. And then we saw numbers where he had incredible zone entries, but then plays just died once he got in. He would carry the puck in at an elite rate, but then there was no playmaking. Plays just died. Well, put those two together. What happens if you ask a guy who gains the zone at an elite rate to put his head down and drive the net once he gets there? Well, you're not making. If you got your head down, you're not you don't have it up, and you're not seeing what's going on around you. You're sure as hell not making plays. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he's got his head up more after doing the skill work in the summer, and that as much as they might like him to maybe put it down and pull that puck to the net more than he has, he's showing an ability to pull up and make plays. Antoine Roussel at times has been a really nice piece on the other wing, complementing him. But, what's 20 goals is the upside. And that's not bad, especially with what they're paying him right now. And that's better than maybe what a lot of people were expecting coming into this year. But he's still got some work to do to get to that. And I think when you look at the players that were picked after him and, some of the success they've had, and this isn't hindsight because a lot of people at the draft were saying the same thing, like Nick Ehlers, William Nylander, these are guys they should be targeting, and they went a little more meat and potato. So again, maybe not fair to him, but it's fair as criticism of the organization because the people that say that now were the same people that said that at the time before they made that decision to draft him with the 6th pick. So again, still a good developing player who may have a role in this organization moving forward, but it's going to be very hard for him to live up to the expectations that come with where he was drafted.
We've touched on Virtanen, Horvat, Pettersson. These are all young guys. They're all 23 or under. Are they the makings of an effective core as the Canucks move forward, or are they really looking for that one other guy at an upcoming draft to really maybe put them over the edge and make them a contender in the West again?
Well, that's a good question. Like I said, they're missing, they're not there yet, right? That's pretty clear. They've had a good season, they've exceeded expectations, and they're basically hanging around in a playoff race that has turned into a turtle derby. So they need more pieces everywhere. But I would say if you look at the farm, even though they haven't had the seasons a lot of us hoped for, maybe the organization hoped for or expected this year, when you see guys like Cole Lind from a skill standpoint, when you see guys like Jonathan Dahlin, who has, clearly a good chemistry built in with Elias Pettersson from their time in the Swedish, in the second division in Sweden. We saw it in the preseason, not so much preseason, but in rookie camp and in the rookie tournament. Those two feed off each other it's unfair to say this, but it's the natural comparison here in Vancouver in a Sedin-like manner. So you see those as guys who might be able to make an impact here, once they get their feet under them in pro hockey. Adam Gaudette, arguably, they had their best run of the season when Sutter was out and Gaudette was their third line center. So again, sort of back to that, why not move Sutter now?
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying overall, when you add those names up, and then there are other guys like Zach McEwen who have had really good seasons in the American Hockey League. Like, I don't think the problem for this organization moving forward is up front. I think they have enough pieces, and you'll be able to sort of find round out that group of 12 in free agency, or however you need to. I don't even think you need big tickets. The issue here, Rob, is the back end. And it has been for a couple of years. I don't think most of us could believe they came back with the same group for another year. They doubled down on Eric and Branson last year, and it doesn't seem to matter who you put them with. There's always that's a pairing they always have to hide. First it was Ben Hutton, now it's poor Derek Pouliot, and Pouliot hasn't been great either. But we were asking these questions of Ben Hutton just a few weeks ago. Now Edler goes down, Hutton moves up to a top pair with Stetcher and looks fantastic, playing 28 minutes. Well, what's the common denominator in this equation? It's the guy you got from Florida and then doubled down on with an extension. So this defense is not good enough. I'm curious to see how Quinn Hughes fits into it with a coach that at times has not loved, say, Nikolai Goldobin, for example, as a player who has an offensive upside but makes mistakes and sometimes doesn't have defensive intensity. From what I've seen of Hughes, there is a tendency to overplay things offensively and that can lead to turnovers. Are they going to have patience with that? Because he's clearly a dynamic potential game changer for them, especially on the power play. The Ulevi, talking about hits and misses in the draft, the Ulevi pick, he was starting to make progress, and then the injury and out for the whole season, and so that becomes a giant question mark for this team. And I think a question mark, like in a perfect world, I think the plan was to trade Alex Edler and have Ulevi come up from the American Hockey League around March and finish his season up here, and that went out the window. Their needs clearly are on the back end. I don't think you ever draft for position. If the best players, if there's a dynamic game changer where you pick up front and not so much on the back end, then I don't know that you can draft for positional need. But the positional need in this organization is without a doubt on the back end, and that's where it gets harder to see with where this team is a couple of years from now and whether they have enough pieces, to on the back end, especially to be an elite team. I think they have the talent up front over time with these young kids, but we've seen it in how many other cities. If you don't have a back end that can transition the puck out of its own end and get it to those skilled forwards, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. You can have all the talent in the world up front. You can end up like Edmonton, giving away half of it to try and chase mediocre defensemen. So that's still the glaring weakness in this organization, and it's one that they're going to have to address. I don't know how they do it. I would suggest standing pat and doubling down on more aging defensemen with injury history, and then telling us every year we were undone by the injury bug might not be the way to go, but it's been the way they've gone so far.
You talk about the back end. Obviously, or key members of the back end tend to be the goaltenders. And are we now in a point where Canucks goaltending isn't controversial for once? I can't remember a time when there wasn't some controversy in the Canucks crease, whether it was Cloutier good enough, should it be Luongo or Schneider? Obviously, in the end, both were moved. Then there was the Nilsson-Markstrom combo. Markstrom seems a bit more solid this year, a bit more consistent. around where not maybe the ceiling people expect him to reach, but at least you know roughly what you're going to get from him. And of course, Thatcher Demko made his debut as well, season debut, but before going down recently with a minor injury, bringing Michael DiPietro into the fold. So all of a sudden, from all the hand-wringing over what the Canucks had done with Schneider and Lou, we're now at a point with two potentially good young goaltenders and a decent veteran in the crease.
Yeah, give us 10 minutes. We'll come up with a controversy for you in goal. And as a matter of fact, we're in the midst of, I wouldn't call it a controversy, but, they've gotten caught with their pants down here a little bit, having to call DiPietro up and not having, a viable option, another goaltender ready to go. Nobody under contract that's healthy in the NHL. Bachman tore his Achilles. He's out for the year. They traded... obviously, Nilsson to make room for Demko. Demko gets hurt in warm-ups. They have to call up DiPietro. That's not an ideal situation. I think they're waiting on Mike McKenna, who was part of that Nilsson trade, and then they lost him on waivers. I think they're waiting and crossing their fingers that Brian Elliott is healthy enough that the Flyers, when McKenna's conditioning stint ends right now in Lehigh Valley, when he comes back up, that they try and get him down there permanently with waivers. And if the Canucks wait that long, I can almost guarantee you they make a waiver claim for Mike McKenna to try and stabilize this. They had an MRI this morning for Demko, and they're waiting on those results. And, if that's going to be 1 week or 2 weeks, as good as Markstrom's been, where he's faltered and actually where his season numbers are average, basically just above NHL average, but actually would be quite a bit better than that, is during the stretch where Anders Nilsson broke a finger on his blocker and was out, and you had to ride Markstrom hard. That's where his game started to break down. And part of that was just, hey, the workload was too much. I mean, this is no longer a league where you play a guy 70 games. I mean, 5 out of 8, 50 games to 60 games is your max range for established guys, and he hasn't played that much typically. And he's making significant changes to his game under Ian Clark. And when you're making changes and you lose the time to work with the goalie coach in practice because you're just playing too much, that's when you see those key elements start to slip in his game. And so this is going to be an interesting challenge for him. Those things are a little more innate. We're further along in the season. He's not they come a little more naturally to him now. So I don't expect the slippage to be as much as it was earlier in the year. And yet I think to expect him to play, looking at the schedule right now, they're in Chicago tonight, and then they go home to Calgary Saturday, San Jose Monday, and then 3 and 4 on the road next week, and then another 3 and 4. Like they've got a pretty busy stretch coming up here, and they probably it gets to that point. We're seeing these goalies around the league. Do you keep running out your number one guy? And Markstrom has become that for them, and start to get diminishing returns. Like if I play him all 3 in a 3 and 4, do I get 80% out of him in the last 2? Or am I better to just, hey, I got to trust, you got to have a backup you can trust, because the backup at 100% and then going back to your number one at 100%, does that give me a better chance of winning than having my number one play all of them and get down to 80 or 70% of his best? Because if there's one trend around the league as we see scoring go up and save percentage take its, one of its most significant dips in years, part of that trend, talking to goalies and goalie coaches around the league, is you can't survive at anything less than 100%. Like there is no B game. You don't get away with a B game anymore. You get torched. That's when they put up sevens.
Yeah.
And so I think the Canucks have done a really good job. There was times where Nilsson hadn't won in 2 months. They were trying to fight their way back into a playoff race, and they would still pull Markstrom in the midst of a hot streak because they recognized there were signs of his game slipping. So get him out, fix it, and get him back to 100 rather than keep running him out there and start to see those diminishing returns. Unfortunately, that's a little tougher when you've got Mike DiPietro, who I like and I think has made some significant strides in his game over the past 2 years. Some of the changes he's made since draft that I think are going to pay off as a pro. But you can't just throw, there's people here in Vancouver saying, I want to see Mike DiPietro. Give this kid a chance to get used to NHL releases. He needs at least a week of practice to feel comfortable, and you have to judge whether he's comfortable facing NHL releases before you throw him to the wolves. Otherwise, if he gets torched, I don't worry about the mental. He'll come back. He'll be fine. He'll get over it. He'll learn from it. But it's more like for an organization that's already taking heat for not having enough goaltenders around, that would just draw even more attention to just this was a mistake. They should have had another guy under contract to start the year. They went with an AHL contract in Kulbakov in the minors, an unproven Russian who has fluttered up and down, and now they're caught with their pants down. They don't have enough guys under contract.
The short term, as you sort of said, is awkward with the injuries and the lack of guys. But long term, is it looking at least healthier? With, I guess, Demko is the heir apparent to the number one job. Markstrom's under contract for another year, and as we mentioned, DiPietro in the system, who's going to get a little look at life in the NHL. I assume they'll send him back down as soon as Demko's healthy again. But is the long term, especially with Ian Clark there as the goalie coach, is the long term looking a lot better?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, Clark's got a track record, and full disclosure, I used to work for a magazine that he run called Goalie News, so I have a relationship with him. There's no point in hiding from that. I'm a big fan. I think that on the list of goalie coaches who deserve to go into the Hall of Fame, it's Francois Allaire, it's Mitch Korn, and then I think Clark is up there as a guy who gets overlooked. Like a lot of the modern butterfly game, like to say he wrote the book on a lot of this, like when I say that, it's quite literal. Like there literally are books that he wrote. And, I remember when Hockey Canada sent a contingent over to Sweden to learn about the things the Swedes were doing over there. One of the questions I was told they were asked by the Swedish Federation goalie people was, why don't you just ask Ian Clark? Because we got a lot of this stuff from him. So I'm a big fan of his. I think he's he proved it with Bobrovsky. Anybody who didn't see the changes, they were obvious in Bobrovsky that led to 2 Vezinas. Like this guy's good. He's one of the best. He's made changes in Markstrom's game that have led to more consistency, adjusted his stance, allowed him to have better access and vision on pucks, cleaned up his movement, taken some of the tension out of his game that used to lead to leaky goals and cause him to open up holes for a big goaltender. And he looks like a legit number one. I mean, star number one, and we'll see. But like, for all the clamoring for Demko and even DiPietro in this market, like people can't overlook that Jacob's been really good this year, and he gets some of the credit too for embracing changes. Not everybody would have, and because he's had a lot of different voices, and you might get to a point where it's like, geez, I was the best goalie not in the NHL, quote unquote, for all this time. Like, why does everyone want to change me? But he's busted his ass to sort of make these things innate. Demko's going through a similar process. And, Thatcher's a guy, to be honest with you, not to, like, shameless plug here, go listen to the In Goal Radio podcast that we have. We had half an hour with Thatcher Demko, and I think anybody that listens to that kid talk about how he's gotten to here and how he approaches the game quickly recognizes that in addition to incredible sort of natural gifts, physically 6'4", tons of length and reach, quote unquote, I hate the word athleticism, but he's got a lot of it. Natural skill. He's a kid that's got his head squarely on his shoulders, and I think has a bright future in the game. And DiPietro's much the same way. Like maybe even more so in terms of the way he understands and the approach and the mental side and everything he does to get better. He just doesn't have the same innate physical gifts in terms of size at only 6 foot. But you add all those factors, a goalie coach with that track record. And goalies with that skill and more importantly that type of approach, and absolutely, I think the future's bright here. I mean, we went into this year and it was hard not to draw a line between Clark and Sergei Bobrovsky, who I knew was going to leave Columbus at the end of the year. I think anybody with half a brain knew he was going to leave Columbus at the end of the year. If you were connected to that at all, you knew he was leaving Columbus at the end of the year. It was easy to draw a line between him coming here and Ian Clark being here, and Clark being able to get the best out of him. And maybe also, like, if it was a Quinn Hughes and an Ole Juolevi on the back end, as we talked earlier, like what better sort of security blanket that you could go out there and play and not stress so much about every little mistake than having a 2-time Vezina winner behind you. But as this year's gone on, and we've seen what Jacob Markstrom's been able to do, I don't know, as much as Bob is, I believe, has an ability to be at another level talent-wise, I don't know that gap is worth the contract that's going to command. If you're able to get what they're getting out of Markstrom at his salary and have all this bright future coming, I don't know why this team now, as much as I saw it as a natural fit just 3 or 4 months ago, I don't know why they would do that now. I think they're going to be fine in goal. So like I say, I don't worry much about the forward position other than maybe spending too much money on guys who become anchors. I'm really worried about defense, and I'm really not worried about goaltending. So they got two of the three. It's just that real important one in between those two layers that they got to figure out.